Welcome to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. There are no traffic jams along the extra mile when you're studying for your bar exam. And now your hosts, Jackson Mummy and Megan Saya from Celebration Bar Review.
Hey, everybody, welcome. It is Wednesday, March 16th. We're glad to have you with us. If you're not on spring break, what's wrong with you? It is spring break week. And hi, Megan, how are you? Good to have you.
Hi, doing well. How are you?
Good. This has been spring break in your house, hasn't it?
It has, yeah. We just got back from Yosemite last night. So that was a really fun trip with the kids. Got to get outside and do some hiking and get some fresh air. It was lovely.
That's great. And not think about the bar exam for a couple of days. Are you?
Yeah, exactly. Nice to take a break.
That's right. And June, you're with us. We're glad to have you back. And no spring break for you.
No,
No, you're
spring
still
break.
working. I know.
I know.
There you go. And we're glad to have all of you with us. We are in that weird lull period, aren't we? When it's not quite, we haven't quite geared up fully for July. We're not getting results from February yet. And everybody's like, where do we go with that? Interesting times, aren't they, June?
They are. We're a little bit in limbo until I think everybody in another couple of weeks will be well rested and ready to jump back.
There you go. All right, Megan, I'm going to turn it over to you. And why don't you steer us through the things we're going to talk about? Today, we are going to talk about contributory and comparative negligence. And well, I'm excited about that. So stick around. We're going to do a deeper dive there.
Wonderful. All right, Jackson, one thing that I did want to point out to people this week, in case I'm starting to hear a little bit of gossip about the NCBE and how they are starting to pilot test the new types of test questions that they're going to be having on the exam. This is, of course, they're planning on changing the exam in a few years. So this is not at all applicable for people who are right now, but in a few years from now, they're planning on revamping the exam. And they're talking about, we're going to be doing some testing of these new kinds of questions. So we reached out to the NCBE to ensure that these new questions would not be tested on people who were sitting for, let's say, the July exam. And so, Jackson, if you want to tell us, what did the NCBE say to you?
Yeah, thanks, Megan. The NCB gave us a very quick response and said, absolutely not part of the July bar exam. We're not using any July bar takers to test these new instruments that they're working on. So I don't know where they're going to test them or how they're going to test them. Maybe they'll get some volunteers out of law schools to do it. But we wanted to be sure that there was a big firewall between the new exam in 2025, 2026, I don't know, maybe even later, and what's going on currently. And so Megan and I wanted to raise this with all of you today because we know that the rumor mill just takes on a life of its own. And you could start hearing, oh my God, there's a new test and there's going to be new questions and test questions. No, if you're taking the bar exam in July of 2022, nothing changes at all. And frankly, nothing changes in 2023 and probably nothing changes in 2024. So for everybody that's on this call today, this is a nothing burger. We just wanted you to be aware that there's some rumors out there. The rumors are not true. One of the nice things about the fact that we are a licensee now for almost 30 years of the national conferences, we have a pretty good relationship with them. And so we contact them and say, what does that mean? And they got right back and said, oh, no, that's not what we meant at all. So sometimes it's good to clarify those things.
Yeah. So don't worry, you won't have any sort of out of left field practice test questions on the July exam. So you're good. All right. So one last piece of admin news, Jackson, is that we have no webinar for the next 2 weeks. So like we said, this is a calm, quiet time in the world of the bar exam. We're very excited for a few weeks from now when the results start to come in jurisdictions. But in the meantime, we're going to take a little break. I believe the podcast will still be running, but we will not have a webinar.
Yeah. And just for those of you that are podcast listeners, I just did an interview with a fascinating woman, Carolyn Fossil, who has a website and podcast and blog called Olive You Whole, but it's spelled OLIVE, like an olive, and then YOU and WHOLE. And she is a fitness and wellness expert and just an incredibly talented individual. And we talked about wellness and fitness and how all of those things fit in when you're doing high stakes exams. It was a great interview. That's going to be our podcast next week. And if you didn't happen to catch our podcast from a couple of weeks ago, the talking about cadence, it was an amazing conversation, again, with another very talented individual. What we're trying to do is that in some of these gaps where we're not doing just updates on the bar exam news, we want to bring some of the best and brightest minds together to talk about learning and education and health and fitness and high stakes and stress and how to manage all those things. So make sure you check all of those out. We're excited to be able to bring you those particular resources. So that's what's going on. We're going to take a couple of weeks off, as Megan said. I've got a new granddaughter just born in Atlanta, Georgia. So I'm going to check out a grandbaby, although they never let me hold the babies. In any event, I'm going to be there. And so I get to do that. And we will still be here and available and doing all the things we normally do. We're just not going to do our Q&A. So that's the deal.
Wonderful. All right, so let's move into just a few student questions that we had from this week, and then we will jump into our comparative and contributory negligence discussion. Exciting. Multiple choice question here. What percentage of the multiple choice questions should I be getting right at this point? The student said, I'm not doing as well as I would like, but I haven't attempted to memorize or review my notes yet. Do you recommend the subject and notes be reviewed before multiple choice questions are done each time?
Okay. So you saw that question. You said, I don't know, context. And why did you ask the context question?
Because it's way, way too early for people to be worrying about the percentage that they're getting right on multiple choice questions. Like way too early.
Way too early. So I think there's an interesting distinction to be made. I think that the way you should be using practice questions at this stage and for a long time until we get closer to the exam is to help you learn the law. It is not to evaluate your performance. It is not outcome based. It's process based. And so the design of the course is built on this idea of a three-legged stool. You are reading or photo reading, then you're doing the lecture. You're hopefully creating mind maps. We'll talk about those more in a few minutes. And then you're doing practice questions. The practice questions are really designed to help you learn the law. And the way you do that is you answer a question, you review the answer explanation, you add that to your notes or your mind map, and then you move on. You should not be trying to take any of these questions at this stage as though they were a real life exam. That is, you shouldn't be trying to put yourself under a clock and time yourself. You shouldn't be worried about how many you're getting right because it doesn't. You've seen people that get virtually none of them right at this stage, and then they do just fine on the exam. So it's not a problem that way, is it?
Yeah. And certainly too, if you're just doing, which at this stage, you should just be doing the subject specific MBE questions. And so obviously, if I got 80% of my contracts questions does not mean you would get necessarily get 80% on the MBE because of course the MBE has many different subjects beyond just contracts. So yeah, I think definitely I know it's really hard for us to convince ourselves that the metrics don't matter right now because we just are very data driven, right? I think as a culture, and this is what we want to know. Just tell me all the info so I know how I'm doing or predict how I'm going to do in the future. At this point, it's really about understanding it. So to answer the student's question about should I be reviewing the subject before I do the multiple choice questions? I think that's great. If you're a photo reader, you should be photo reading the outline. If you're not, I think go through your notes, right? You don't want to sit there and go through all the material over again, but just do a little brush up on, hey, let me remind myself, refresh myself what this subject is about. Then sit down, do the multiple choice questions. And then the key is review the answers, right or wrong. At this point, I want you reviewing it all because I don't want you to say, oh, good, I got that. I don't need to think about it because we're so far away from the exam that I want you to be sure that you didn't get it right as a fluke or you don't really understand why it was right. I want you to make sure like you really understand the concept that was being tested. So that's the key. This is just like with the creating the mind maps, it's the journey, not the destination. So it's the actually doing these questions is what we care about right now, not what the end result is. I do not care at all, actually, what percentage you got on each of these subjects. specific studies. I only care about with each question, do you understand the principle that it's testing you on? And if not, let's go back in and see if we can understand it a little bit better.
Yeah, I love the word that you use, predictive. It is not predictive at all. We have a lot of data points. That program I just talked about that we use tells us how every student has done on every question. And so we've got this huge body of work. I guess we could pretend that we've got an algorithm, couldn't we? And then we'd be like somebody else in the industry. But the reality is that it is not predictive at all. There is nothing that tells us that if you miss contracts question number 4, how you're going to do on the bar exam. Not at all. We used to have what we called marker questions. And then we determined over a period of time that the marker questions didn't really tell us a lot unless they were really easy questions and you were missing them because you were over reading them. So there really isn't anything that's predictive at this point. There are 2 other words that cause my back to arch, I think, and I get a little freaky. One is the word issue. We're not going to talk about issues today. But the second is memorize, right? There is no memorization in this course. I cannot say this often enough. And I know that many of you come here from having taken the big box courses. You've been told to memorize, you've crammed. It's been your approach. Megan and I did a deep dive into a study done by Access Lex Institute. Was it last year before? On the bar exam. And they did a study of bar takers for the bar examiners. And they looked at what techniques worked and didn't work and what was effective and not effective. And golly, can you believe this? They found that memorization wasn't very effective. We've been saying that for 30 years. Memorization is not the way to learn. You learn through repetition. And so when this student says, I haven't memorized my notes yet, my heart just wants to leap out of my chest and say, oh, please don't memorize. Don't waste your time doing that. We want you to do what Megan just described. Go back to your notes, look at the explanations, think about the material, put it into your mind map, but don't spend your time trying to create a flashcard or memorizing or doing some list of elements because it isn't rewarded on the bar exam. It's just not a successful approach.
Always keeping in mind that the key thing that they're testing on the bar exam is your ability to apply the law, not to know what it says word for word. So I know that's really hard. It's so counterintuitive to everything that you feel like the bar exam should be. And I will tell you that the bar is a really idiosyncratic test. It's just not, if you've done writing workshop with me or you've been coached by me, I say it all the time that this is not like your law school exams. It's just not. And in many ways, the bar exam is terribly unfair. It's not fairly predictive of your actual abilities to be a lawyer, but it is what we've got right now. And so we want to do everything we can to get you to pass this test, even if it feels, but gosh, wouldn't it be more helpful if it was, if I did these things and I learned this, but if that's not what the exam's testing, then I don't care about it for these purposes. Okay. So that's why we say we want you to learn the skill of how to apply the law, which is not memorizing it, because memorizing it doesn't actually tell you how it functions or how to use it. Okay. And that's what we want you to be able to demonstrate to the examiners is, hey, I know how to use the law, because ultimately that's how you pass the bar exam. So.
And that's why I like these deep dives that we're doing, Megan, because when we take these smaller concepts and we mind map them and we think about them and then apply them to the questions, we're not memorizing anything. We're just saying, here's the concept, try to understand the concept, conceptualize it. The mind map, I think, is a huge tool, probably the most effective tool to do that. And then start working through it and adding to the mind map as you look at the answer explanations, because that's going to give you some nuance. So later today, in a few minutes, when we talk about negligence and comparative and contributory negligence, you're going to see exactly where you could do that and how you can build your notes from the answer explanations. And that's really the value that we want people to get from doing these practice questions.
Exactly. Always put it in context. Always. I just don't think that there's any way to truly understand the law in a way that you need to pass the bar without having context for it so that you can recognize on the test, oh, I know. And sometimes this is subconscious. It's not that you're literally thinking this, but your brain in some form is thinking, I've seen this before. And I haven't just seen it as a list, or I haven't just seen it as a definition. I've seen it in action. And so therefore I know how to apply it in action here. So that's the purpose of these. All right. So, with that being said, Jackson, we had a question about how to create mind maps from outlines. And I don't know how much you want to talk about that. And it's
Yeah.
going to mesh really nicely with our discussion.
Let me just give some introductory comments and then we'll go into our specific conversation about negligence. The I think it's a great question that comes up about I've got the material and maybe I've got it in hard copy or maybe I've got digital copies or the PDFs and I want to create mind maps. How do I do that? And of course, we have a product called Bar Maps, which has got pre-made mind maps in it. So if you want the first 2 or 3 levels of every subject, literally in your course, all you have to do is pick up Bar Maps. It's a great jump start. But as you often say, you don't have to have that tool to be able to do it. You can create your own mind maps. And even with bar maps, you want to create them and generate something on your own. So I thought it would be useful to just briefly explain what I do when we're sitting down to do one of these deep dives. Megan and I pick a topic and we say, okay, here we go. And the first thing that I do is I go into our multi-state outline book. And so for today, we were going to talk about contributory and comparative negligence. And so I go into the digital book first because it's easy to do a search. And I just type in comparative negligence or contributory negligence, and I see where the references are in the outline. So I found that section in the outline, and it's about 4 or 5 pages in the printed book, but in the digital book, about the same thing. And I then pull that up as a digital file, a PDF that I can highlight. And I like to just take a pen or an Apple Pencil or just marking it up and highlighting it. And what I'm going to do for the purposes of creating a mind map is I'm going to go through and highlight all of the headings and everything that's in bold typeface. Now, I know you're the editor, and so I'm giving away your secrets here, but you and your team take the important concepts and you make them visually attractive. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great way to put it.
You highlight things, you put them in bold, you put note boxes for cases, you put things in italics. Why do we do it? If you're a photo reader, it's because we want your non-conscious to process all that. If you're not a photo reader, we know your eye is going to be naturally drawn to those things, and we know that those are the most important details. Unlike some other companies in bar prep, we don't use fill in the blanks. We use what we call narrative outlines. And these outlines started literally, they were first drafted in the 1970s at Harvard Law School. When Megan and her team gets to them now, oh my God, we're talking about 50 years of work on these things. They are well produced. There's a lot of content there. And so what I want to do is I can't put all of that content, and I don't want to put all that content into the mind map. I want to get the highlights. So I take those boldface headings and subheadings and the pieces of information in each paragraph that are bolded, and I highlight them on my digital PDF. Now, if you were using a print book, you'd take a highlighter, right? This is pretty old school. You take a yellow highlighter and you highlight it, or 10 colors, whatever. But I like doing it digitally because then I can take that digital copy, set it up on my screen, split my screen, and I go over and I create the mind map using a mind map program. And I start creating the mind map from the things I've highlighted. Do you want to say something there, Megan?
No, that's great.
Okay. All right. Are you with me? All right. So she was giving me that clue. Yeah, go ahead. Say more about that. I wanted to make sure as I set up my mind map, I want to start getting those ideas in. The beauty of a computerized mind map is that I can move things around and they all stay organized and I can see them because all I'm doing is just dropping data into the mind map without thinking at this point, how does it fit? What's the relationship? And relationships really matter in mind maps, don't they?
Yeah, I think that's the key beauty of this tool is seeing how things are connected rather than when you're reading it through the outline, it can feel sometimes like a bunch of disjointed paragraphs that it feels like, gosh, I forgot we were even in this subtopic. By the time I got 3 pages in, I didn't even realize we were still dealing with this subtopic. Whereas when you can see it visually, it helps a lot of people to understand, oh, here's the like points within this subtopic, which is part of this larger topic. It's just a much quicker way to recognize where you are.
Exactly. And you're going to see that in a second when we jump into negligence, because you really do get lost in the weeds. It's very easy to say, where am I in all of this? And the mind map lets you see the exceptions and what's connected and where you go. So when I'm doing a section like this, it takes me about 15 minutes to highlight in the outline. and that's probably fairly slow, and about 15 minutes to get it over into the mind map. And then I've got it in a half an hour for that topic. Now, you don't need to do the hundreds and hundreds of pages of the outline this way. This is just the harder pieces for you, the sub pieces. We've got all the basic stuff already built into bar maps. But when I want to go deeper on contributory and comparative negligence, here's a half hour I can invest in it that's incredibly valuable. And that's what I really want people to do. I've made an explainer video in our private network. For those of you that are in the course, you can check that out. I literally show you the files and how I did it for this particular topic. You can follow it through. It's about a 10-minute video. I encourage you to watch that so that you can see how that process works. And now you're going to see the result of it. So with that, I wanted to jump into our discussion. So we have been talking about the study questions that keep you awake. And as I say, we've been talking about some deep dives on topics. And today we're going to talk about comparative and contributory negligence. And the question that we got from a student was, can you explain the difference between comparative and contributory negligence in torts? Now, I want to be clear, and Megan, you and I were talking about this. This is not a state-specific subject. That is, in California, I don't think there is a difference between those two. And in most jurisdictions, they'll say we're a comparative negligence jurisdiction or a contributory negligence jurisdiction. This only exists in the world of the multi-state bar exam. But there's one other thing I want to point out about this. Even though it comes from torts, you will see contributory negligence or comparative negligence referenced in a lot of different questions outside of torts. Evidence, for example, it'll say the defense is raised of comparative negligence and which of these statements would be admissible or inadmissible. So don't automatically assume when you see these words that you're in a torts question, because it could show up in other places. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, great. So what I want to do, as we've been doing previously, is to start with the big overview picture of the mind map that we created. Now, we will put this mind map with its links into the show notes. And if you are in our course, you will have the full ability to use and share this and work with this mind map. If you are watching the podcast, obviously you can see it and we'll put the link in the show notes. And if you're in bar maps, you've got this as well. So lots of different places. I'm going to make it much bigger in a minute, but what I want you to see is what Megan was talking about earlier. The broad topic that this fits under in torts is defenses. And you could see that we've got contributory negligence over here. We've got comparative negligence over here. We've got some rules, lots of rules about contributory negligence, a few of them about comparative. But then we've got down here, hard to read, but it says assumption of the risk. Well, we're not talking about that at all today, but that's another defense. And you could add information about that as well so that you know where you are in that section. So that's the idea. One of the things I like being able to do is to highlight some of these main points, as you see here, where you see the red and the blue and so on. And again, if you're more visual than I am, you could certainly set up and put icons and more detail and information. The other thing I would just point out to you in general is that you'll see that we've got, and we're going to get down here to proximate cause in a minute, that's here. And you can see we go out several levels, which is what Megan was talking about. Seeing the connection is really important, and the ability to see the different levels. You have any comments about that, Megan, as you're looking at it?
No, I hope that's clear for people, that even though I know that the font is small here, just to try to give people a big picture, but hopefully they're can track with the concept.
Yeah, and we're going to go through the mind map now in more detail, but I just wanted you to see what it looks like, and that's what it took me about 15 minutes to do. There you go. So let's move on. And we're going to start, again, this particular mind map is called defenses. So if you're looking for it in your materials, that's where you'll find it. And the first of these that we want to talk about is contributory negligence. So as we're asking this question about the differences, remember we've got two broad categories, contributory and comparative. So let's look at contributory first. Now, the first thing that you need to know about contributory negligence is that it is a total bar to recovery. If there is contributory negligence on the part of the plaintiff, they're not going to get anything. So it's a pretty harsh rule, isn't it? You're in big trouble. That's bad news if you're a plaintiff, but it's great news if you're a bar taker, because if you see contributory negligence and it fits all the other categories, the result right away. a lot easier to work with than comparative negligence. So we're going to do some questions where we're going to explain that a little bit more. Now, you notice down there in gray, I've got burden of pleading. This was an area that wasn't as important to me, I thought, in trying to answer the question. So there's not much to put there, and I'm not going to highlight that as much, but it's in my materials. And if I had a question that dealt with burden of pleading, I could go back and perhaps add more detail to that. But I know that the primary thing I want is that rule in red. All right, then the next thing I want to know is what's the standard of care? When we think about contributory negligence, really what we're asking ourselves is, when does it exist? When do you have that kind of negligence? And we have a definition, which is a reasonable person under like circumstances. And I think that makes sense to people. I think that they can look at that and say, okay, I get what's going on there. We've got a reasonable behavior, a reasonable person under like circumstances. And given that, I think it's really valuable to be able to identify that that is our standard of care that we're going to use. Now, again, you're going to see below that, there's some information about child plaintiffs. And I didn't highlight that because at the point I'm doing the mind map, I don't know how important child plaintiffs are. We're actually going to do a question with child plaintiffs, and we'll see something else here. But you'll notice that what I put in there is that the standard of care for a child is basically the same thing, a child of similar age, intelligence, and experience. So that's what we're looking at there. All right, then we get to this idea of proximate cause. And proximate cause, we've got 3 levels of analysis. The first thing is just the definition, because proximate cause, when we're talking about contributory negligence, is only going to apply when the plaintiff's negligence contributes proximately to injuries. And that's very different than normal proximate cause analysis, which can have lots of different causes. When we're talking about torts, you can have a bunch of different proximate causes, but when we're talking about this particular concept, it only applies when the plaintiff's negligence directly or proximately relates to injuries. And the second level of this is that the plaintiff's negligence must be a cause and effect of their harm. That is, they could have been negligent, but if it didn't actually lead to their harm, that's not contributory negligence. And you might say, how do we know if their negligence is a cause? We've got 2 tests, the but-for cause and the substantial factor. And we could go into greater detail on those, but I just think it's helpful to see the concept here and the structure and organization. Megan, you have any thoughts?
No, hopefully I think that's a nice way that sometimes if reading a paragraph about it is confusing, sometimes visually spreading it out a bit can be very helpful, I find.
Yeah. And this particular slide doesn't show you the connector points, but when you look at the big mind map, it shows us connectors. So it's a little easier to see it that way. All right. Then the next thing that we've got to do, typically in a multi-state question or a topic, is to look at exceptions or how do we distinguish something? So we know that there are avoidable consequence kinds of problems, and that's not the same as contributory negligence. And so we've identified 3 kinds of questions that come up. They weren't wearing a seatbelt. Is that contributory negligence? And the answer is no, it's an avoidable consequence. What if the plaintiff was traveling at an excessive speed? That's distinguished as well. That is not contributory negligence. What if there was a conscious exposure to danger? I don't know exactly what that would be, but that's also distinguished. So in these 3 situations, we know that we've got something that's different than pure contributory negligence. So nice to have that, I think, as a set of exceptions to look at. Then we've got some claims where contributory negligence can't be used at all. And boy, this is really important because whenever we're dealing with multi-state, right, Megan, we want to find the exceptions. Where can we cut something out or not deal with it? And one of them, the big one in my mind, is an intentional tort. So battery, assault, right? Anything that's an intentional tort, you can't use contributory negligence. So even if you're a jerk and you cause somebody to slug you, it's an intentional tort. So contributory negligence isn't going to be something that the defendant can use. If there was a willful and wanton tort, can't use it there. If it's strict liability, I've got a strict product liability problem. And wasn't it a few weeks ago, Megan, we did a strict product liability deeper dive?
We did, yes.
Yeah. And if you have strict liability, guess what? Contributory negligence can't be used. And then finally, if it's negligence per se, you're violating a rule or a statute, contributory negligence can't be used. So I think that's super valuable. Maybe you want to put that instead of green, you want to put it in red or with flashing neon lights. But the idea is this is where you can't use contributory negligence. And then the last piece of discussion for contributory negligence is what we call mitigation. If the defendant had what's called a last clear chance to avoid injury to the plaintiff, then the plaintiff can get a full recovery even if they had contributory negligence. So look, I was negligent, but the plaintiff still had another last clear chance to solve this problem and they didn't take advantage of it. Hey, I'm going to get my full claim and contributory negligence won't bar me. So that's the last clear chance. And the second is mitigation by imputed negligence, which means that if I've been negligent as the plaintiff, but there's the negligence of a third party, that can't be attributed to me. And so we want to be careful about that. And so you'll see some negligence of a third party. So when you put all that together, those are all the rules of contributory negligence. Now, we could go into more detail, but I think that gives people a pretty good overview, don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. So now that's contributory negligence, but we've got the other side of the mind map, which is comparative negligence. Now, comparative negligence is actually simpler to understand or simpler to put the rules down, but maybe harder in practice to work with. The general rule of comparative negligence is that a plaintiff recovers damages that are reduced by the percentage of the negligence attributed to their own behavior. So instead of the complete bar to recovery that contributory negligence jurisdictions have, if you're in a comparative negligence state, now you get a percentage reduced by your own negligence. As a general rule, that's nice. It's tough to figure that out, isn't it? So the examiners have to give you a lot of detail, and we're going to see an example of that in a minute. The other thing that I think is worth pointing out is that the examiners have to tell you if you're in a comparative negligence jurisdiction or a contributory negligence jurisdiction. They are not going to leave that open-ended for you. So don't freak out about that when it comes to an MBE question. All right. Now, the next piece of this is that we've got two forms of this kind of comparative negligence. The first is called modified comparative negligence. And in that situation, what's going to happen is that you get that provided that your negligence as the plaintiff is not equal or greater than the defendant. So it's only going to apply if you've got less negligence than the defendants. I don't know. How do you figure that out? It's a little tough. The examiners have to tell you that. And then we've got pure comparative negligence, which means that you can obtain as the plaintiff a reduced recovery even where the plaintiff's negligence exceeds the defendant's. So what you're looking for is if the question tells you it's comparative negligence jurisdiction, it will tell you if it's a modified or pure state. And this is what you must know about the two. Does that make sense?
Yes. The nice thing I think with these kinds of questions is they're so dependent on the jurisdiction. And of course, the MBE is taken by or almost everyone. Almost every jurisdiction does the MBE, which means that they have to give you a lot of detail because it's not enough to just say, hey, we're going to test the rule. They have to tell you we're in a place where here's what the rule generally is. And so I do think that's very helpful with these questions.
Yeah, I do too. I think it's a big assist. All right, let's do some practice questions now and see how we can do with it and start to apply this. All right. So here's question number one, and I'll read it for those of you that are trying to stay along with us here. With permission of his single mother, Jimmy, a 10-year-old boy, drove his bike along the side of a busy highway to his grandmother's house. It started to rain, and a driver passing Jimmy negligently skidded into Jimmy, killing him. If the applicable jurisdiction has adopted the rule of contributory negligence, and mother brings a suit against driver for wrongful death and for Jimmy's pain and suffering, she can collect. All right, now, what do we get right away? First of all, it's contributory negligence, so you're on the right-hand side of the mind map. Secondly, we've got a single mother, and that will be covering the estate. She will be suing on behalf of poor Jimmy, who's now gone. It would appear to me, don't you think, Megan, that mom probably has some negligence there in the way that she let a 10-year-old drive his bike along the side of a busy highway? I can't imagine you letting Adam do that, would you?
No, I do have to laugh though sometimes some of these older questions, like with permission of his single mother. Oh, the horror that she's a single mother, like who's being so negligent.
Well,
So anyway,
yeah, they
that
were
was
doing it
funny.
for a reason. It's interesting. It is a little anachronistic, but they were doing it, and I'll show you explain why in just a minute they did it because it struck me as weird too. And then I thought about it a little bit more, and I was like, oh, I know
Yeah.
what they were trying to get at. So
No, I
let's see
think yeah, I think I know what they were trying to do too, but it is so funny. Sometimes
a
you
little
read
weird,
these
right?
older
Yeah.
questions and it is
All right.
good.
Look at our answer choices here, and let's see what we've got. All right. So, mother can collect in this suit, A, even if both she and Jimmy were negligent. Okay. B, only if neither she nor Jimmy were negligent. Which all those. C, if Jimmy was negligent, as long as mom wasn't negligent. And D, if mom was negligent, as long as Jimmy was not negligent. Those are all the options, aren't they?
Yeah,
So,
yeah, that covers it.
how, how can mother collect? Can she collect if they're both negligent, if neither of them are negligent, if Jimmy is negligent, or if only mom is negligent? So that's why it's the single mom thing, if she's negligent, because there's no other third party there. Now, let's go back and think about our rules. What did we say about contributory negligence? It's a total bar to recovery, right? And so, how could it be? How can mother win this case in a contributory negligence setting? So, with that little clue in mind, folks, if you're watching live, jump into the chat box and tell us A, B, C, or D. And again, I can't do the Jeopardy theme music. I wish I could, right? It would be so helpful. Megan, you have any other clues for people or tips as they're looking at this one?
Yeah, I think
By the way,
that
don't be marking on your screens because it shows up on mine for reasons that I don't understand. So somebody's already marking up stuff.
yeah, I think with this one, you want to figure out first what her position is because they're talking about if whether she was negligent and Jimmy was negligent. You want to figure out what her position is, not just as the mom, but in this, like, what's her role, right? In terms of negligence, and then what was Jimmy's role, and then you want to figure out whose negligence or potential negligence would matter in this
Yeah.
case.
Yeah. All right. We getting some responses in the chat?
Getting a couple of D as in dog.
Okay. D would say if mom was negligent, as long as Jimmy was not negligent. That's an interesting answer choice. All right. Any other choices that people have here? Remember the big rule. I guess my clue wasn't very good. All right. Let's see what happens here. All right. Let's move on. We'll look at the answer choices. A, mom can collect even if both she and Jimmy were negligent. All right. That is not the right answer. Most wrongful death statutes say that wrongful death is an action to recover the damages that the decedent might have recovered if they'd lived. So in this case, the plaintiff mom is on behalf of the decedent, Jimmy. So a wrongful death recovery could be limited or barred by the decedent's negligence. As a result, A and C are incorrect because Jimmy's negligence would bar mom's recovery under the Wrongful Death Act. So one of the things we have to understand is that in this case, now we've got a new piece of the rule, which is that the decedent here would be mom, or the decedent is Jimmy, but mom stands in Jimmy's place. And so therefore, Jimmy's negligence, which is imputed to mom, bars mom's recovery. So A and C are going to be incorrect. All right, let's look at answer choice B. That is actually our correct answer. And here's why. It's the easy one. And if you thought about it and said, no, it's too easy, you're overthinking. Mother can collect only if neither she nor Jimmy were negligent. Remember what we said about this particular rule. Either the decedent's negligence or the beneficiary's negligence could prevent a recovery. So negligence by either mom or Jimmy would bar all recovery. And that's the only answer that gets us there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think what probably trips people up is that's why I said try to think about the position of the parties is mom is the beneficiary, but she's also the person who's suing. And so I think that's the key that was maybe missed is because I could totally understand thinking, well, it only matters if Jimmy was negligent because he was the one who was on the scene. But really, it also matters if mom was negligent because mom is the one who stands to gain here. She's just as Jimmy is standing in her place and his negligence would be imputed to her in this suit, her negligence potentially would matter as well. So I think that's where you want to at the position of where the parties, not as mom and son, but within this lawsuit, what's their
And I would even go simpler. I would just say, look, if mom was not negligent, if that's the decision, and if Jimmy's not negligent, then there can't be contributory negligence because neither of them are negligent. And so that to me is the simple solution. And so I think you can overthink it and make a mistake. We already talked about answer C, but let's talk about D. And I do understand that we had people answering that way. D said mother can collect if she was negligent as long as Jimmy was not. But again, as you just pointed out, Megan, since the beneficiary is the actual plaintiff in this kind of a wrongful death situation, all of the defenses, including contributory negligence, apply to her and operate to bar the beneficiary's action or reduce the recovery. So that's why D is incorrect. All right. So what I would do at that point is, having seen those answer explanations, I would probably go back to my mind map and add some information about the idea of wrongful death statutes and the beneficiary stepping into and becoming the plaintiff in that situation. Don't you think that would add to it?
Yeah, definitely.
All right. All right. Everybody shake it off. We're going to do another question. All right. Because I do think this is helpful. Ready? You ready, Megan?
Yep.
All right, let's go. Here's question number 2. A, B, C, and D were involved in an auto accident. The jury found that each suffered $100,000 in damages, and that the accident was caused by the negligence of A, that was 20%, B, 30%, and C, 50%. And I'm not using their names because it's too much for me. The accident occurred in a state having a comparative negligence statute and a contribution statute. Now, we haven't talked about a contribution statute. The comparative negligence statute, which did not abolish the common law rule that joint tortfeasors are jointly and severally liable for the resulting harm, allows a party to recover provided his negligence is not greater than the combined negligence of the person or persons against whom recovery is sought. That sentence is a mouthful. A party's damages are, however, diminished by the percentage of negligence attributable to the party. The contribution statute, okay, here we go, under which relative degrees of fault are not considered, allows a joint tortfeasor to recover contribution from any other tortfeasors. And now we get to the call of the question. In an action by A against B, C, and D, A should obtain. All right. There's a lot to break down in that question, isn't there?
Yes, but it's one of those great ones where they basically told you all the rules that you need to know. So I do like
that. Yeah. If you don't freak out, it's
Yeah.
pretty straightforward. We know, what do we know now? It's a comparative negligence state. We also know that joint tortfeasors are joint and severally liable. We know the rule about joint tortfeasors. So even though they explain it painfully, we know that rule, and that shouldn't throw you. It's just a lot of word salad, I think. And they tell you that the damages are diminished by the percentage of negligence attributable to the party. And they tell you the contribution statute, which allows joint tortfeasors to recover contribution from other tortfeasors. So we have joint tortfeasors here, don't we? They were involved in the auto accident, and we know that A was responsible for 20%, B was responsible for 30%, and C was responsible for 50%. So we've got all the information that we need there. And if you don't freak out about the question and just start to break it out, and this might be one where you want to just jot down some notes or highlight it as you're reading it, it's going to be more straightforward than you think. So let's look at our answer choices. In this action by A against B, C, and D, A should obtain, and here's answer choice A $30,000 judgment against Beth, B, and a $50,000 judgment against Kathy. All right, so I got to actually use their names now because it gets confusing. So again, answer choice A says that Anne should get a $30,000 judgment against Beth and a $50,000 judgment against Kathy. Answer choice B says Anne should get a $40,000 judgment against Beth and a $40,000 judgment against Kathy. Remember, this was a $100,000 judgment, and Anne had 20% of the liability. Answer choice C says Anne should get a $75,000 judgment against Beth and Kathy. And D says that Anne should obtain an $80,000 judgment against Beth and Kathy. All right. How do we break that out? There's a lot of different things there. And I think at this point, a lot of people start going, oh, math, I'm dead. First response for a lot of people.
Yeah, that's why they always do these with nice round numbers. So they give you $100,000.
Yeah,
It helps
yeah.
a little bit.
And I think it's important to go back and look at what we've got in the question. Ann's responsible for $20,000 of damages. Beth for 30,000, Kathy for 50,000. So we know that we're in a comparative negligence rule and in the state, and joint tortfeasors are jointly and severally liable. And we know that your damages are diminished by the percentage of negligence attributable to that party. And a joint tortfeasor can get contributions from other joint tortfeasors. That's actually makes it pretty simple to know that certainly Ann could get a judgment against more than just one person. So we've got that piece. We can see that in all of the answer choices. And now the question is going to be how much and from whom? All right. Again, don't overthink it. The most simple, straightforward answer is probably going to be the right one. So mark down your thoughts about A, B, C, or D. Megan, you want to add anything here? We're waiting for people to answer.
I think, yeah, it's the biggest problem that people tend to have with these is that we all went to law school for a reason because many of us are not super big fans of math. And so I know it can feel a little bit overwhelming when you see these and it's easy for your brain to start to panic. So don't let it like you just said, Jackson, I think you broke it down really nicely that there's this $80,000 that's floating out there. And so really this question, what it's asking you is how are we breaking it up? Given the different rules of the jurisdiction that they've shown you, how do we break up that $80,000? So
Yeah, and to me, that makes answer C immediately wrong. So at least I can get rid of that one if I have
yes.
to.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see what we've got here. All right. Answer choice A says in an action by Ann against Beth and Kathy, Ann should obtain a $30,000 judgment against Beth and a $50,000 judgment against Kathy. That's the incorrect answer. Remember that the jurisdiction has a modified comparative negligence statute, and it gives you the usual rule that we've talked about. So regardless of the ultimate responsibility of each defendant for a share of the damages, Ann's going to be able to recover the full amount minus her own negligence from either the defendant or from either defendant. So because of that, answer choices A or B might have been correct, depending on the contribution law of the jurisdiction, if the question had asked about the result of an action between Beth and Kathy, because they were the joint tortfeasors, right? But it doesn't state the correct result in a suit by Ann against Beth and Kathy. So the distinction here is if it asked about what would Beth and Kathy be able to do against each other, yeah, that's probably true, but that's not what it was asking. So answer choices A and B they're definitely both going to be incorrect. So again, same analysis here for answer choice B, which said 40,000 against Beth and 40 against Kathy. That would have been the joint tortfeasor, but it doesn't get to Ann's piece. All right, let's look at answer choice C. That said a $75,000 judgment. And the way that you might have got to that, it's an incorrect answer, but you might have said, look, there was $100,000 of damages and Ann's share was 1/4 or 25% of Kathy and Beth's share. That's a lot of math. That's too much math for me. And I can't imagine a whole lot of people going down that road. But if you did, congratulations, you should have gone to engineering school, but it is the wrong answer and it doesn't help you at all. It's just, whew, really? Somebody did that? Pretty amazing, isn't it?
Yeah. The
All
nice
right.
thing to know about the bar is they're not going to ask you to do that much math.
Way too much. All right. So that leaves us with D, and that's the correct answer. An $80,000 judgment against Beth and Kathy. Why? She can get it against them jointly because we're told that the comparative negligence statute allows her to recover for all of her damages. That was 100,000 less the amount that corresponds to the percentage she was at fault, 20,000. So answer D is correct. All right. I had one more question, but I ran out of time. I'll put it in the video that we do later, but I wanted to just get that for everybody there. So fun. I hope that's helpful. Hopefully we gave you, I hope we're getting some comments here. People are like, oh my gosh, learning something about comparative and contributory negligence. Again, the mind map will be in your materials. We will do the full video with the third question and put it into your course materials so you can catch it there if you're registered in our course. All right. Any other comments as we wrap up that discussion?
No, I think that was great. Thanks for going through all that, Jackson.
Yeah, fun. I know you just love comparative and contributory negligence.
Yeah, not my favorite.
No,
Not my favorite.
don't do this to me. No, no. All right. So hopefully I didn't throw Megan under the bus. Listen, I want to thank all of you for being with us today. Glad to have you here. Those of you that are watching on replay, we're glad to have you with us. We come to you on Wednesdays. We're going to take a couple of weeks off for spring break, and we will be back in April as results start to come out in the UBE. April 11th, I think we get Florida results. So there's some good stuff happening there. June, thank you for being here. Appreciate it. Helping out. And I hope everybody has a good study week and does well. And stay at it. Keep working. And we'll see you in a couple of weeks, right?
Wonderful. Have a great week, everybody.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening and watching the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers at celebrationbarreview.com.